What's going on, guys? Welcome to Shots of Awe. Now we're doing these extended conversations, these creative sessions with some of the luminaries who have inspired so many of these episodes. And you're about to see my conversation with Erik Davis. Erik Davis wrote TECHGNOSIS, which is a book that literally tickles my brain. It is a cognitively ecstatic experience to read that man's words. And it's fascinating because his commentaries about technology, myth, magic, and mysticism in the age of information, actually, they put me in his head. Like, I feel like I read his observations and I relate to them, and the thrill of feeling like there's someone else in the world who's thinking this way about these big issues is astonishing. So I hope you guys enjoy this extended creative session with the brilliant Erik Davis. So, Erik Davis, it's a thrill to be here with you. You have inspired me to no end. I mean, I just gotta say, first of all, let me thank you. Thank you for your work, for your ideas, for your book TECHGNOSIS, which is being reissued and which has blown my mind to no end. This book looks at technology in a very different way than most people think of technology. I mean, people use technology to extend their capacities in the world, to extend their communication abilities, but people also have an apprehension about technology. They're afraid that the robots are taking over. You look at the kind of Gnostic undertone. So why don't you at first just kind of tell me a little bit about where TECHGNOSIS
Sure.
came
No.
from?
That's a great question. I mean, I got interested I got a sense of what was going to be happening with technology in the late 80s already. I was studying postmodern philosophy and reading Gnosticism and science fiction and Philip K. Dick. And then I became like a culture critic. I wrote for the Village Voice, and I wrote a lot of record reviews and things like that. But I noticed, just sort of on the horizon, that there were these strange juxtapositions of technology and religion, technology and mysticism, and they were so peculiar because we don't organize the world that way. You know, there's religion and mysticism and magic. There are old stuff over there, maybe in our dreams, maybe in our fantasies. And then we have the technology, the world we actually, rationality, science, progress, you know, leaving the shadows in the wake. And I noticed that that's actually not true, and that there's all sorts of ways in our stories, in our habits, in the images, of the way that technologies are packaged and sold, where we actually draw from the religious imagination, let's call it, whether it's from Christian ideas of progress, or occult ideas of magic spells and powers, or Gnostic dreams of transcendence and kind of you know, moving onward and upward into the heavens through our technology. And so what I wanted to do is sort of tell like a secret history, an esoteric history of technology that paid attention, that drew all these shadows and figments and stories out of the background and brought them forward so that people could see really what was going on already in a lot of ways.
1,000%. And what continuously blows my mind, you know, and I experience a kind of bibliomancy every time I open this book. It's this idea that any page that I open it to, there's something really relevant and really just astonishing that you point out about our relationship with technology. You know, one of your chapters is called The Spiritual Cyborg, right? That we are a cyborg. We are in a sort of coevolution with our technology. We extend our minds into our tools and so on and so forth. But that there is this spiritual yearning, that we are beset with a thirst for meaning that continues. You know, we may build the Hubble Space Telescope, put that in space, mainline space and time through the optic nerve, but because why? Because we're looking for the holy other. We're trying to blast new tunnels between the mind and the other. It always comes back to the pressure of being a conscious being, to be sentient, to face mortality, to fancy ourselves as gods, but to be ultimately food for worms. And I just felt that you just identified that thread throughout, and you did it so vividly. And your power with language, with words. I mean, where do you go when you write this stuff? And also, like, these observations that you were making probably reflect a journey that you were taking. I mean, it probably comes from a place of you wanting to understand and you being beset with a thirst for meaning. So tell me about that.
Well, like a lot of people, I would say I was a spiritual seeker of sorts. I mean, for me, it was often a very intellectual pursuit where
Yes.
I wanted to know where these things were coming from, religions and mystery and magic and the occult and meditation and all that stuff. But I was also a practitioner. I was searching. I want, you know, and in some sense I still am.
Yes.
So I was fired up by that. But at the same time, I saw technology coming. I understood it really well. It was like, you know, my father's a scientist. I was really tuned into science and mathematics, studied mathematics, and even though I didn't end up studying science, I got seduced by the humanities.
Right.
I've always had a real attraction to it, unlike a lot of people who work in the humanities. So I started to see that all this stuff was coming and that it was really going to change everything. It was already changing everything. It was changing finance. It was changing you know, our self-image. It was changing how we think about ourselves. And so I could see this kind of almost kind of apocalypse on the horizon, you know, and it was the early 90s and you could tell the end of the century's coming, what's going to happen. There's this sense of a kind of millennialism that I was tuning into that sort of brought these worlds together. So for me, it was really an attempt to kind of integrate different sides of myself and to continue to sort of tune into what was happening in the future, but to recognize that these yearnings aren't going to go away.
Right.
They just get rephrased in a new point of view. So
Repackaged,
so the spiritual cyborg is basically the idea that, you know, a lot of people who yearn for spirituality or for a religious connection, they might think that technology is taking us away from everything. You know, that we need to return to our roots, return to nature, we're too artificial, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I have a lot of appreciation for that view, but in a way it's kind of obvious.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask a deeper question, which is what happens when you actually embrace the technological framework, including the idea that we are, you know, DNA meat machines that are, you know,
we're made of language, bro. We're software.
You know, spinning ourselves in the void, and now as we've extruded all of these algorithms and technological processes that have their life of their own, that we're now sort of riding this thing. How do we engage all that and embrace that, but still pay attention to, even be driven by these deeper yearnings that go much, much farther back in our past? And so that's the kind of dialectic or tension that I'm really trying to work out in the book.
Which is dazzling. And you know, you talk a lot about the emergence of the cyber culture in the late 90s and the connection with the millennium and this idea that there was this dream that these tools were going to liberate us from the biological sort of meat machine, the biological straitjacket, and that we were going to unleash our minds into a virtual world. As Terence McKenna said about virtual reality, this will allow us to turn our minds inside out, that new forms of intersubjectivity could be attained because we would graduate from being naked monkeys making little monkey noises thinking they see God and actually actualize a cosmos for the imagination that we could inhabit. You know, technology, as McKenna used to say, is congealed imagination. But now we can actually move into and live inside of our congealed imagination. I mean, we're already kind of doing it. I mean, talk about architecture, talk about aircrafts, but like even more so, the promise of virtual reality. This was there in that cyber culture in the 90s, and you were pointing to it. But then there's been this disenchantment now. Do you think it's going to come back? I mean, now virtual reality is emerging. Now I can rub the magic mirror on my iPhone and summon a car that synchronizes with my Spotify playlist to play the music that I love so that my phenomenological flow starts to feel like a re-enchanted world. I mean, the Internet of Things, predictive contextual computing starts to create a world of enchanted objects, a world of animism. So all of us start to feel like we're in a kind of an altered state of consciousness where everything is in sync with us, and we start experiencing engineered serendipities. Do you think that that's possible, or are you feeling like, oh, it's a bunch of corporations that are manipulating us?
Well, one of the things that I talk about in Techgnosis is that when there's new information technologies enter into a culture, when you have the telegraph, when you have the telephone, when you have television, radio, when those technologies initially enter into social reality and begin to transform the way that we experience ourselves, communication, and a relationship to time and space. When those things happen, there's a sort of weird gap in the world where suddenly there's a recognition that we're kind of making this up as we go along, and it's not really clear what the new form is. And so into that gap rush fantasies and dreams and revelations and terrors and demons and fears. And that tension between the up and the down, the demon and the angel, is sort of part of the inheritance of technology. So when you ask that question, you know, the answer in a way is boring. It's both and.
Okay.
And that the moment of revelation that we're kind of moving into, in that sense of, oh my God, it's all things coming together. There's a kind of fantasy that I'm living through the technology. There's a kind of synchronicity, these effects that are producing a much more enchanted sense of moving through ordinary life.
Yes.
Are intimately and absolutely coupled with a kind of deep suspicion and alienation. And that those are also features of technology, they're features of advanced capitalism, and that if anything, they're closer, they rub up against each other even more than ever before. And so I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist in the way that people like to align themselves. I'm much more interested in trying to see how the dance between these poles happens, and in always paying attention to, we have to own our own projections too. We have to recognize, what are we really fearing? What are we really trying to transcend? What do we really want? How much is our, you talk about Becker a lot. How much is our fear of death, our secret, constant, unconscious awareness that we are mortal creatures, motivating our trivial perceptions, our desires, our enjoyments? And so for me, it's really about using historical complexity, conflict, this weird conjunction of beauty and awe and terror and paranoia as an opportunity to go even deeper into this ever-evolving human condition, and to keep that edge sharp.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Becker and the idea of human mortality, but I mean, ultimately, technology is the ultimate anti-entropic extension of biology. I mean, Bucky Fuller used to say life is anti-entropic. So entropy moves towards destruction and simplification of everything, but then life moves towards greater complexity and organization, upwellings of structure, self-organizing, sublime complexity that just seems to emerge. And then we extend our biology with the technosphere. Kevin Kelly calls it the Technium. He says it's an organism, the seventh kingdom of life. And so that this move towards this anti-entropic move towards more complexity, of course, is connected to our desire to want to overcome entropy itself, to overcome mortality itself. I mean, on the one hand, you can listen to a beautiful piece of music while listening to your Bose wireless headphones, and the magical music is streaming from your magical smartphone, which has 10,000 melodies magically stored in its electronic circuitry, and you listen to it, and that gives you a real experience. There's nothing virtual about virtual reality. That's a real virtuality, as Zizek says. And I listen to that music, and I might get moved to tears, and I'll get the goosebumps and the chills, and I feel connected to something larger than myself. I technologically mediate ecstasy and become as a god almost. I enter god mode, to use a video game term.
Right.
But then, the next day I have a headache, or I see a person who's older and is suffering from an illness, and I'm like, holy shit, this is the existential bummer.
Right.
Should we not use these tools to transcend our mortal coil? Should we not, the ape that wants to molt himself into angel?
Right.
That's your line.
Yeah.
We must become machines. We must become gods. Man is a bridge, but not an end.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, I'm going to approach it from a slightly different angle, and we'll get to that point.
Yeah.
Which is, I have a whole riff that I'm pretty convinced about, which is that hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure, including awe and wonder, is a profound path. In most ways of looking at it, hedonism is seen as sort of superficial, materialistic. It's not religious, it's not ethical, it's not higher.
Right.
And our society and ourselves are very hedonic.
Yes.
We are trained and we learn to enjoy, and we have great pleasures at our fingertips if we are lucky enough to be part of this aspect of our world.
Yes.
But I think what people miss about hedonism, what they don't understand, is that if you're really asking, is this really pleasurable? What is the whole package that comes along with my pleasures? If you start to become aware of the network of effects, where things come from, where are they leading, what is the larger arena within which I am enjoying, then suddenly things start to shift a little bit, because it becomes a little harder, for example, to truly exult in the God power of your device.
When it was made in the factory.
Right, when you know about rare earths, and you're like, oh wait, those are, actually the materials that we need in order to shrink technology come with it almost as some kind of alchemical allegory, are bound with highly radioactive material that is very toxic and extremely expensive to get.
We're playing with fire.
We're still in the alchemical wager. It's a kind of alliance with forces of the earth and forces of destruction and fire, as well as light and transcendence. And I'm not saying that recognizing this means that we should pull back and destroy the machines and try to return to some Paleolithic existence. But I do believe that you have to go further and further into the complexities as part of the pursuit of true enjoyment. So for me, you start to ask a question, what is transcendence? What does it mean to transcend? Is it really transcendence to embed myself in particularly technological frames? Or perhaps there are other ways of moving the mind, other ways of touching what is essential in us that perhaps move at a different angle than the sort of relentless pursuit of the high. Because that comes with entailments, that comes with hidden packages. It's all allies, alliances, pacts, deals, balances.
Always. Well, it's so interesting to hear you say that, because I think that there's different flavors of transcendence. I think on the one hand, there's a feeling of ecodelic interconnection with everything, where you basically are extending your empathy. Most people say empathy rarely extends beyond our line of sight. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind. So an elevation in consciousness means you start to be aware of more interconnection, of more consequences to your everyday experience, and so you extend your empathy, and that's a kind of transcendence and a kind of communion with everything else. But there's also other kinds of transcendence. There's just the mediation and steering of awareness towards states of exaltation in the sublime. And that can just be listening to Rachmaninoff on the piano and being moved to tears while you stare into the iris of a lover's eye, which is something I've been trying to do since I was in high school, okay? It's why I love cinema, right? Because it's the last altar left. I get to go to that temple of the IMAX theater, which is the modern equivalent of the Gothic cathedral. It's what Alison Griffith wrote about in the book Shivers Down Your Spine. That is a temple and a place where your awareness can be mediated and pushed towards places that tickle your soul, crack for the soul. And that the soundscape and the massive screen can push you somewhere else, can silence the part of the brain that's responsible for self-awareness. You forget yourself. And that transcendence is pretty blissful too. I mean, we're all bliss junkies in a way.
Sure.
And I still think that there's validity in that. There's
absolutely.
Kind of ecstatic about that.
Another way of approaching that is just asking this question, which is, there's been a lot of neuroscientific study of the emotions. But it's interesting to go, like with any science, you always go, okay, why they're asking certain questions and they're not asking other questions. So what do they look at? They look at love, pair bonding, fear, anxiety, depression. These are the things that were tons of research dollars, like what's happening in the brain. Very, very little work has ever been done on wonder and awe. As if wonder and awe are not absolutely fundamental parts of our nervous systems, our humanness. As if there's sort of some kind of weird fluff that can be ignored as we get to the real deal, which is like these survival tactics. And part of the reason is because wonder and awe, it's not so clear what their sort of selection viability is. Why do we have that? It's not clear exactly why that leads to the perpetuation of the species the way that fear and anxiety and even depression have arguments for.
There was a book, and I did a video about it called The Biological Advantage of Being Awestruck, where he says our capacity to awe makes us work harder to survive because of the bliss we get from it. And that's why it was biologically selected for.
It
makes us be impregnated with meaning because of that feeling of being connected to something. It's almost like the idea that the brain has a God hack in it. That the reason that God hack was pre-selected for is because it makes us feel like we are holy beings, and that makes us fight harder to survive.
Particularly in terms of a group collectivity. Religion clearly exists partly not just as a sort of ideological control, mind control kind of thing. It's also a way of orchestrating our affects and our experiences and our sense of awe and communion so that we collectively begin to identify with shared myths, shared rituals that bring us into resonance and allow us to survive and to prosper as a collectivity. And I think one of the problems that we have right now is you can just see there's so much dissension, there's so much violence between, you know, religion and people, different perspectives, that in a way we're like, how do we tap into that potential for awe, that potential for compassionate, blissful connection with an idea, with people, with ritual, but somehow take it out of the parochial quality and the sort of tribal quality. It's like we both want, we need some of the essence of tribalism to return to in the kind of breakdown of modernity, the breakdown of progress, and yet that tribalism also has within it a lot of the most terrifying possibilities of growth of fascism, of a kind of hatred, and like increasing.
People share in that, they bond over their hate over something.
You know, and so when I see like even the conflict now with the the Republicans and the Democrats, and it's just how nasty it's gotten, how sort of worse it seems like the rules are being broken down. It's more feral, it's more out of control. That sense, which I think is pervasive in our society, and it has that like real kind of scary question of where does a certain kind of tribalism, I believe this, you guys are all crazy, and I have the websites to prove it. Everything kind of feeds back on itself, and yet there's something in that connection, that bond, that's very archaic, that we're working on.
So how do we dissolve those boundaries? I mean, McKenna used to talk about get on an airplane, fly 12 hours and go into another reality tunnel. Once you get to have a visceral experience of how other people live, you tend to be a little less judgmental. You start to realize there's not so many rights and wrongs, there's just different,
Yeah.
But my question that I wanted to ask you was, we're seeing a revolution now that's connected to that idea of dissolving boundaries with psychedelic research. McKenna used to say computers are drugs and drugs are computers. They're basically computers for inner space, and we're seeing society kind of have a turnaround, a change in the attitudes. I mean, marijuana is probably going to be made federally legal very soon, psilocybin studies for people with terminal cancer being given magic mushrooms and reconfiguring their whole perception of life and death. Do you think that this is a step in the right direction for potentially the instantiation of a new kind of consciousness? Because, like club culture, you go to a party in Vegas or party in Miami Beach, and that is the expression of party alcohol culture. Like our drugs turn into our environments. Our intoxicants are then reflected in how we hang and where we hang and what the places we hang look like and feel like. As more people start to turn on, as the culture of these entheogenic substances becomes more accepted, how will that change the world? Not to get all utopian.
No. I mean, a lot of things will be happening at once. I never underestimate the capacity for human beings to degrade the sublime. Right. And so, and you could take that even with looking at party culture and how MDMA or ecstasy, whatever is being sold as MDO, and those have had very different expressions. There's something very utopian about the rave scene, and there are aspects of it that are really just an extension of that alcohol, crass party thing, which is fine. It's just part of our human baggage as well.
Fair enough.
To not be judgmental, but it also shows that initially MDMA was seen as, this is maybe a panacea. Maybe this is the utopian pill that we need to create bonding and connection.
10 years of couples therapy in a pill.
Of course the results are a little more fragmented, and I think something like that will happen with psychedelics as well. On the other hand, it's obviously extremely positive development. One factor that does seem to stay with people, because that's one of the questions. Like, you can have awesome experiences, transcendent, sublime, cosmic, all the beautiful adjectives in the world. Yeah. The question of how it changes people over time is much more murky. It's not clear that if there's anything inherent in any experience to change someone permanently. Where true transformation comes from is much more of a difficult question. You get a bliss junkie, people fall into addiction, they revert, there's all sorts of things that can happen. But one thing that seems to be, studies show, is a result of psychedelic use is greater openness to novelty. That there seems to be a genuine sense that the nervous system, the mind, whatever you want to say, the soul, gets better at handling questions ambiguities, boundaries, and others.
Right.
And for me, you mentioned the other at the beginning of this conversation. For me, increasingly, as I think about these things, as I think about spirituality, as I think about ecology, as I think about psychedelics, as I think about, what are we doing with all of our devices, it really comes into how are we getting closer to the others.
Yeah.
And by the others, I mean the cosmos,
right.
I mean animals,
Yeah.
I mean microbes,
Yeah.
I mean circuits, I mean databases, I mean this non-human, ahuman world that we're absolutely inextricably enmeshed in, that is in some sense alive with its own, not just in the sense that the animals are alive, but the whole system has a sprightliness.
There's agency, the Matrix has meaning, the Matrix is alive. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that as well, because now in order to be able to witness, to make observations about this aliveness, to sort of alter our experience of the world enough that it becomes re-enchanted, that we feel more connected to it, that we feel more compassionate to it, and that we're alive to the magic of being, we need to be playing with subjectivity, which is an obsession of mine. You've written about it. You wrote an essay called Experience Design and the Design of Experience, where you described experience as an evanescent flux of sensation and perception that is, in a way, all we have and all we are. And you say that new media technologies, the cultural production of media technologies, needs to get better and has to acknowledge that what it's trying to do is engage the technical material of subjectivity itself. That our cultural technologies are becoming more like roller coasters than like movies and books. That we are hacking the body mind and being taken to new places. Talk to me a little bit about subjectivity and how we play with it. I mean, you use the term heterotopia to describe the buzz that happens at certain gatherings and conferences when people that share certain values come together and you start to enter this other space with these people, or the space when you're talking to somebody on the telephone across the ocean. Like, where is your mind in that moment? Tell me about heterotopia and playing with subjectivity and mediating subjectivity.
Okay. Well, I mean, I start talking about heterotopia. That's a term from Foucault, and what he's trying to point to is that we have an idea of utopia, of like some perfect place where everything works out. And he's like, maybe, good luck. But heterotopia is a place where otherness is allowed to run riot. So an easy example with qualifications would be something like Burning Man, where people go, and particularly early on when there was less cultural ideas of how you were supposed to behave and what it was meant and what clothing was supposed to be and the furry hats and all the, it develops its own, heterotopia never lasts. It's always an evanescent point where people come together and there's a kind of open-ended question of like, we don't know what social interaction is going to be. We don't know what subjectivity is going to be, how our connections are going to happen here. And I think there's a part of us that really seeks that because we recognize in that the possibility that things can be other than they are, that the world doesn't have to be the way that it is.
That's thrilling, because then we transcend Michael Pollan's been there's and done that's of the adult mind. The existential boredom or despair or belief that you've seen it all and there's nothing else to be excited about. For novelty junkies, for people who get a thrill from the idea of something new, of something more, that seems to be the antidote. Anything that triggers an experience that there could be something else is addicting.
And that's it. And that's a good point. I mean, once it becomes addicting, if it really is addicting, then something more complicated is entered than just the sort of generosity and richness of such experiences, because they become a little bit
you kind of know what you want from it.
And you got that. So that's part of the trap. That's part of the dialectic. And for me, what it means is part of what the idea about subjectivity and becoming more aware of how our subjectivity is produced is that even as we refine and extend our pleasures, our enjoyment, our capacity for intensity, our capacity for transcendence, for connections with others, that there also has to be and will be, either by ourselves or by the people who are producing those experiences, an increasingly, let's say, third-person understanding of how those things come about. What are the forces that are
the anthropologist
composing?
has to make the observations from the outside.
Right, or the technologist who's tweaking the device that you're using to get off. So, to my mind, expanded consciousness
Yeah.
is not just the exaltation, especially the exaltation produced from technology.
It's the expertise as to what it takes to get there.
Exactly, and it's a movement. It's a movement where we move into intensity, we take everything we can from it, we enjoy it, we draw from it, and we feed it back into a more critical understanding of what's leading to this, what's actually behind it, what actually does it, what are the entailments, what are the connections, and that's where you start to get involved with a more critical sense of like, who's actually making money from this?
Okay.
What are they doing with my data? What are they doing with my... And so I, think that both sides of that is what it means to become more and more intimate with subjectivity.
So we've been talking about subjectivity, right? The nature of lived experience. Now, I'm a fan of ecstatic states. I'm a fan of flow states when you feel your best and you perform your best.
It's wonderful, huh?
Yeah. Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel of the Flow Genome Project talk about advances in technology, psychopharmacology, neurobiology, and psychology, the 4 pillars that are allowing us to peer beneath the hood of what's going on in our brain during these ethereal, mysterious, numinous mind states. But I guess I want to talk to you about the subjective experience of subjective states that we love. You once gave a talk where you talked about dream walking. You go through certain urban settings and you're able to catalyze a mood where you're able to actually be receptive to the fact that architecture, objects, streets, buildings, cathedrals, architecture talks to you, right? Like when you design something, it has shape, it has a form factor. I mean, there's agency and intention and a language to the forms and figures that we make, When you walk around Prague or Berlin or Amsterdam or New York, if you're in the right receptive subjective states, the world of objects talks to you. There's a kind of animism, right? How do we turn on our openness to that animism versus the normal operating baseline consciousness, which is task-oriented, and I got to get from here to there.
Yeah.
And I'm not stopping and staring up at the cathedral for 15 minutes, marveling at the forms of the concrete, the mindedness in the man-made world.
No, you're asking...
How do you get there? How do people get there?
You're asking a really key question. It's not easy because, the world, the empire of work is also everywhere we go. I mean, that's part of what it means to always be online and always be in the network.
Needs,
Right. And in my experience, my answers, my practices tend to not be particularly technologized. Like while I appreciate the kinds of things that cinema can deliver, that virtual reality can deliver, that games can deliver, that there's a lot of ways in which that even pharmacology, even raves or whatever, that my answers to your questions are kind of more simple and embodied, and they really have a lot to do with the body, and not just states of mind, but really this body. That there's a way of walking, there's a way of holding, and those are things that, in some ways, are personal to me, that I've discovered in my body because of the way it's constructed over a long period of time. But I think that there's a way of learning the subtle edges of consciousness, which are almost imperceptible unless you're kind of really looking for them or have a good structure to see what they are, that a lot of very ordinary states conceal right inside of them fabulous opportunities. That the mind that takes the daydreaming mind, the mind that takes a nap, the mind that spaces out, that sort of stops staring at the field in front and kind of opens the ears to take in the totality of the sound. If you start to develop these kind of simple, which it's kind of like meditation, but it's more like meditation on perception, on the text, playing with perception, that can actually provide over time. It's like meditation, like a lot of these things. It's not instant. A remarkably more enchanted world.
I have to ask, most people, if they want to unwind, they'll have a glass of wine, they'll have a glass of champagne, they'll have a vodka. It does something specific to your subjective experience. It loosens your inhibitions. It might make you more horny. There is a specific use for that intoxicant. The majority of Americans now support marijuana legalization. Obviously for medicinal purposes, but also, like in the Michael Pollan article on the psychedelic renaissance, the idea of making well people better. David Lenson, in his book on drugs, he's a comparative literature professor, wrote a chapter on cannabis and marijuana that blew my mind. He says that essentially marijuana fuses cognition and dream and creates a reconcilable estrangement with the world of perception without really distorting it. Now, the reconcilable estrangement means at first the world of the ordinary becomes a little strange and a little extraordinary, but then you get to re-engage with it because of its strangeness and novelty and reconcile your relationship with the world of perception and objects. So somebody might get high and listen to a song that they've always loved, but all of a sudden they remember why they've always loved it. Its soul-searing intensity pierced directly into their brain, or why the aesthete or the intellectual might smoke a joint before going to the Guggenheim Museum or the Amsterdam Museum of the Moving Image. So as America's attitudes about cannabis as medicinal and a recreational substance sort of comes online, how do you think we will be able to start playing with this fusion of cognition and dream to make ourselves more perceptive to aesthetic experience? Because ultimately that's what it's about. You want the home theater, surround sound, external technology, but maybe with the legalization of cannabis, now you can have the internal technology that primes your brain to be more open to that mediation.
Yeah. For me, the surround sound structure is too much. It's too invasive, and it kind of flattens the space of interaction and encounter that I find on cannabis or not on cannabis, walking in the woods before a great work of art, listening to a symphony, listening to even a punk show or whatever. That there's a sort of space there that our technology, as it's getting good at manipulating our consciousness, really wants to move in there and really trigger fast and really dial down and really get us sort of like online with it. And some people are exulting about that opportunity, and I don't have a judgment about that. I'm glad that there are lab rats. I'm glad that there are post-humans who are plunging as far forward into that as they can. That's not my way. And so for me, when you talk about these opportunities, it's a little bit more about how to bring the edge of dream into reality. And so the way you're talking about how cannabis sort of opens up the sort of first layers of dream association, both weirdness and greater intimacy. And I think it's really interesting to imagine that a lot of people who maybe are turning to cannabis for medical reasons because they've always heard about it, now it doesn't seem so bad. The people who are able to have that encounter, maybe they've never been interested in the counterculture and drug culture or anything, that because of that aesthetic sensibility in particular, I think that there is a really great opportunity for people to enjoy nature more, whatever, get out of the ruts.
Yeah, and sort of Leary's ubiquitous idea of set and setting getting fed back into the experience. You're changing the culture in which people can enjoy these intoxicants responsibly. By changing the cultural context in which they're enjoying it, you're changing the effect that they're going to have. Because they're not going to feel scared, they're not going to feel like deviants. Instead, they're going to feel like they're having a drink, except a slightly different effect, and then re-engage with the world through the lens of that prism. It could be interesting to see how it affects consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, something else I'd like to bring up to you. We've talked about subjectivity, we talked about altering our perception with external mediation and technology, with internal technology. We've talked about our hunger that for something more, for a hidden door, to connect with something transcendent, to connect with something infinite, to deal with our mortal coil. A film that resonated with an entire generation, I think continues to resonate, is The Matrix. So here you have a film that was a pop culture phenomenon, but it was a profound philosophical meditation on the nature of reality, on the desire for transcendence and for escape. And you probably wrote, I confidently believe, the most magnificent piece on The Matrix ever written. It's called Synthetic Meditations. And I want to read you a quote by you and have you comment on it. Because when I first saw the film, it unsettled me and excited me. Kind of like certain sexual situations, you know what I mean? But for cognition. Like, it just mentally made me uncomfortable, but also secretly really excited about what this means, right? And the scene in which Neo takes the pill, for those who've seen the film, and then starts melting into the mirror. You describe that scene better than anybody. So I want to read it, okay? So first, Morpheus tells Neo, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. And then Erik Davis sums up the scene. So like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, Morpheus offers Neo a pill. Neo, of course, swallows the molecular package, which is really the most heroic act in the film. For Neo must then face his own Cartesian passage through madness, melting into a mirror that alludes not only to Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, but to the mystic psychotic collapse and disappearance of the externalized ego that stabilizes our inner void. As Neo phases out of the Matrix, he opens up, however briefly, the fractured bardo, okay, that is the secret thrill of every fan of the false reality genre, myself included. The moment when baseline reality dissolves, but no new world has yet emerged in its pixelating wake. So it's when Neo starts melting into the mirror and he's freaking out. It's when Dorothy gets caught up in the tornado and ends up in Oz. It's when we leave our cognitive Kansas behind. It's the dream within a dream sequence in Inception. It's Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. I mean, it's all of these stories. The kiddie psychedelia and the modern Gnostic pop culture. But why do we get so excited from being unsettled about the nature of reality? Isn't that supposed to be just scary? How come we like it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I asked myself that question because I think, like you, I have to answer that as much personally as sort of objectively. I can sort of talk like a historian and say, well, the genre develops here, it's serving these needs, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't answer why I get the thrill out of it and why I have since I was a kid, whether Philip K. Dick or H.P. Lovecraft or whatever, and and even when I study religion and I'm really interested in Gnosticism and the history of esotericism, it's often from a similar point of like, if I keep following this line, it might just start to turn around a corner where now I actually can't rely entirely on my given map of reality. I mean, I think that's a very healthy impulse. To question the sort of framework. And I think that experiencing it as a thrill is kind of a truthful reflection of the way in which we are forced to kind of, that it's always something that happens to us. It's not just an idea. It's not just like, oh, there's another world behind this world. It's an experience of loss, which in a sense is a little premonition of the big loss,
leaving the everyday,
right? And it's a kind of death, It's a kind. I mean, that's the point. Is that Neo has to die not only to the world, but to the person he thought he was, to the relationships that sustain him, the identity that sustains him, the job that he has, all of that, which is a kind of death. And so the idea that there is something more is pleasurable, but also the sense that there is something in us that can navigate such transitions. And I think that's
something survives. There is a witness that can move through worlds,
right? And dance with it, and even move it. And I think part of the sort of secret encoded in the Matrix is precisely that this is also a film in which the special effects that were most novel in that film, which then of course become ordinary in subsequent iterations, has so much to do with the kind of ballet of movement, the kind of the manipulation of time, moving through different speeds and slownesses. All of those to me were an indication of the way in which the films were encoding not just the false reality genre, but also a kind of almost a sort of shamanic encouragement that you actually have the capacity to navigate this degree of uncertainty, this degree of not knowing what's a fiction and what's a fact. And that's, of course, one of the main things that we face, that we're already in this world and that is going to become more intense, is that division between fiction and fact, that the hard reality of where our bodies die, and the water tables are collapsing, and people are manipulating the whatever the economic system for really untoward gains.
Yeah.
That's going along at the same time as which there's this profusion of fictions. In fact, it's really hard to get at reality. If I'm like, gee, what happened with the Boston bombing? It was kind of weird. Like
Okay.
I want to find out what really happened that day.
People fall into conspiracy
What am I going to? Yeah,
theories
where am
and
I going to go? And which conspiracy theory? And then they're all conspiracy theories, and then it's all loose all of a sudden.
Sure.
And I'm in my own private Idaho's, flying blind, trying to communicate, trying to coordinate some consensus sense of reality.
Then you get into like the Roswell stuff, UFOs, this and that.
And I'm saying that not to say, oh, we should be conspiracy theorists, or oh, we shouldn't be conspiracy theorists, because I wouldn't say that either by any means.
Right.
But it's more that dance with fictions, which is in a way the dance of the Matrix, is part of our existence now. It's part of our politics.
Yeah.
It's part of our self-identity.
Yeah,
It's
well,
part.
everything is
it's
theater.
part of what we're
Everything
doing.
is theater.
Everything is kind of theater, and there's some scariness to that. There's some nihilism to that. There's a deep alienation implied in that. And at the same time, there is an invitation to a better kind of play, or a better kind of performance.
Yeah. Well, even just cognitively, intellectually, and aesthetically, for me, I think it provides a safe place in which I can go to dangerous places and ask dangerous questions with my mind. I mean, I think that Neo taking the pill and then me wondering, what's it gonna do? And then he turns right and his arm starts to melt. The freaky, almost like schizophrenic disjointing of everyday reality is the cognitive equivalent of when you're going up on the roller coaster before it's about to flip over the top and drop insanely.
Yeah.
You can't really even see the bottom because it's going up, but it's about, and that feeling you get in your stomach, the cognitive intellectual equivalent of that is that.
Yeah.
Or the dream within the dream scenes in Inception, where he explains that when him and his wife went into the limbo, the fourth layer, then they decided to hide their little artifact, and then she forgot that she was in a dream. So that after living a whole life there and him saying this was all a limbo, let's wake up, then she brought the belief that that dream wasn't real into their real waking state. And that's like a person having a psychotic breakdown, is a person that can become convinced that this reality is not real. Because I mean, if you're fully convinced, that's it.
Yeah.
You're not tied into the consensus trance.
Right.
You're either in your own personal heaven or your own personal hell.
Yeah.
And I think that flirting with that in these kinds of films gets certain people off.
Right, yeah.
You know? Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, another example.
Yeah, and that's also very old. If you go back in the history of religion, particularly in India, you know that there's very ancient tales of dreams within dreams within dreams, of people living entire lives and then realizing that it was all just a fantasy, a drama, and da da da. So that idea is very fundamental part of human consciousness. And I think it has to do with our experience of dream, in the sense that this is not a cultural construction. This is something all human beings dream, and all human beings have been dreaming for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And one of the conclusions from dream is that I can be very much in a real world and then not anymore. And that gap is a kind of gap of freedom, but in a way, we can only get into that gap of freedom by also risking either psychosis or death. You know, and that's part of the thrill, because we're just getting a little flavor in it. If movie, it's safe, I'm in a cushy seat, I'm eating popcorn. And yet there is a kind of cognitive memory and anticipation of other kinds of gaps that maybe are much more significant.
In the Matrix, right.
And that's partly then how we navigate a culture that is changing so fast, that is so full of fabricated realities, and that is so full of glitches and noise. That's why for me it's always really important to pay attention to not, as well as using a technology to get what you want or to enjoy what you're going to enjoy, and even recognizing how it is a kind of congealed dream of a possibility is that at the same time it's also kind of a pain in the ass. You know, it brings along things that I didn't intend. It doesn't work the way I want to. And if I look into the conditions under which it was made and how it's being sold and how it's entering into people's lives, then I see all sorts of glitches, all sorts of cracks, all sorts of little abysses that open up. And for me, it's like we're in a process now where both of those minds have to be operative. So I think that there's something very powerful, as well as juicy about these gaps, these glitches, these cracks, because that is where our critique lies. That is where our willingness to not buy the comforting dream lies. And so we learn to play with that.
Self-correct, yeah. Well, it reminds me a little bit of that Danny Boyle film, The Beach, when they sort of find that island and they go to this paradise, and then the whole idea is nobody wants to bust up the party. So when one of the characters gets sick or one of them gets bitten by a shark, they just put him in the woods and throw him away, so it's out of sight, out of mind, because nobody wants a buzzkill.
Right.
Nobody wants the high to go away.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying, and you're saying so well, is that even as these tools and technologies, the myth, magic, and mysticism that's giving us so many wonderful experiences, that we should still be mindful of what it took to get there and what are the consequences that it's causing, so that we can remedy, self-correct, adjust, upgrade, and make sure that we are living to our sort of potential as, you know, people that believe in justice and have a sense of right.
Absolutely.
That we're not just bliss junkies at the expense of, but rather that we can sort of bring everybody into this waking dream as we author it.
Excellent. No, well said.
Dude, this has been an absolute treat. Just a cognitive thrill. You've taken me on the best kind of roller coaster, Alice in Wonderland. I've transcended my cognitive Kansas and everything I like. So thank you for what you've produced. Thank you for existing. Thank you for Techgnosis, which has been reprinted, and I think everybody should read as part of their journey.
Yeah, people still like it. I mean, it was written a while ago, and yet it still resonates. You know, it clearly inspires in some way that I'm not entirely in control of, and I'm very happy
but
about
not
it.
from you, and though it is with you, it belongs not to you.
Excellent. Well put. Well put.
Right? But whatever it is you channeled into, man, I just really want to thank you, because this is the kind of book that I like to take with me, and I like to open to any page, and I like to read something fascinating that usually triggers a Shot of Awe episode and all kinds of cognitive thrills. So make sure you pick up Techgnosis. Make sure you follow Erik Davis on Twitter. He's at Erik_Davis, Erik with a K at the end, at Erik_Davis. Get Techgnosis today. And your podcast. Why don't you tell everybody about your podcast?
Well, it's called Expanding Mind, and it's on the Progressive Radio Network, and it's been going for about 5 years, and we cover consciousness, neuroscience, spirituality, technology, the sort of zones that are covered in this book.
Yes.
It's a weekly chat, very similar to this, sort of informal but heady.
Yes.
And I have a wonderful co-host, Maja Dawu, the White Witch of LA. So I got to give a shout out to Maja. And we have a lot of fun.
Yeah, so check out Expanding Minds, and thanks for watching Shots of Awe, creative session in conversation with the dazzling Erik Davis.
I love it, man. Your enthusiasm is great.
Thanks, man. It's all real, bro. So I can't help it.
It could be, but you know, for me, the best part of a trip is always waking up in the morning. I mean, coming down is the good part. You know, it should be anyway. Coming down is the part where you're like, okay,
What have I
now
learned?
what? Yeah, what did I learn, and how do I apply this, and what is this? And then, you know, and then you go out in the woods and you smell reality again from that new place, and you realize, oh my God, I'm only 1% of what I could be.